Welcome, KJ No, to the Burning Archive. It is great to have you back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, Korea's really been in the news recently with a few issues, but the one we really want to focus on at the moment is the outcome of the Constitutional Court. Is it the Supreme Court or Constitutional Court decision? Anyhow, the removal of President Yoon from office following his impeachment. And there are a few other issues we'll talk about today. But why don't we just hop straight into that? It's like 48 hours, maybe a little bit less than 48 hours since the announcement. What has happened in South Korea?
Well, let me give you a quick recap of Yoon's, the circumstances that led up to Yoon's impeachment, just in case people haven't been fully paying attention. But remember, on December 3rd of last year, Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea, declared martial law. This martial law was rescinded in 6 hours, but it was only rescinded because National Assembly members ran out in the middle of the night and were vaulting over, fences and fighting off special warfare forces that had been sent to prevent them from voting down the martial law. Now, as I said before, martial law in Korea means that the country is a military dictatorship. It is a traumatic term to use because it immediately sends people back to 1980s, 1987, 1979, etc., where the government had a brutal hand and was disappearing people, killing them left, right, and center. So huge traumatic moment. South Koreans overcame it. They shot down the martial law declaration. Yoon was impeached about 2 weeks later. And then from that point, since his impeachment until 2 days ago, the entire system seemed to have slowed down. Everything was hanging fire. And in the meantime, Koreans were losing sleep because they're wondering, this is an open and shut case. The question is, did this violate the Constitution? Well, the question is, did he declare martial law? Yes, he did. He's on television declaring martial law. Did he send troops in violation of every procedure to prevent lawmakers from voting down the martial law? Yes, absolutely. There are television images of, lawmakers skirmishing with martial law troops. And so it was neither justified nor was it procedurally sound, etc. Open and shut case. The hearings on the Constitutional Court case on the impeachment had finished a month ago, and everybody was wondering, why are they not delivering a decision? I mean, it's a child could deliver that decision, overnight.
And like there was, I guess, growing anxiety or concern about what that might, what that suggested about what might happen. Yeah.
Yes, there was tremendous anxiety, and there were several things that were adding to the anxiety. One is that Yoon was arrested at tremendous cost. There was tremendous standoff, but he was finally arrested from his presidential residence, and then he was released on a technicality, and that is a very, very bad sign. The fact that they twisted the law and redid arithmetic in the judicial system in order to release him suggests that there was some extraordinary arm twisting or corruption going on. So the fact that Yoon was released from prison was very, very disturbing. Other people who had supported Yoon's resistance, they were also their arrest warrants were denied, and then at the same time we saw this tremendous rise of a pro-Yoon reactionary counter force that arose. Very, very reactionary, very, very dangerous. They went into the courtroom that issued the warrant for Yoon's arrest, and they completely destroyed it. They destroyed a courtroom. So we're looking at Maidan type
Mm.
violence.
Mm.
And then, one more thing I think that had people very, very worried, in addition to Yoon's release and these counter protests that had arisen, was that there was tremendous pressure from high powered US
Mm.
officials or former
Mm.
officials, most notably Morse Tan, who was ambassador at large for a previous administration. And he had repeated the trope that Yoon's followers had been saying, which was that the impeachment was a Chinese conspiracy, that the
Mm.
Chinese were behind this, and they were trying to impeach Yoon because essentially, once Yoon was impeached, the DPK would come into power, and then they would be following China's directions.
Mm.
Extraordinary, extraordinary language. But he literally threatened the Korean government. He said that if you impeach, if you uphold the impeachment of Yoon, South Korea will face tremendous consequences. It will face the wrath of the United States. He literally used
Mm.
words. I mean, he said they'll, seven 200, sanctions. It will be sanctioned by the United States.
Mm.
They would be considered an enemy state. And so strong pressure, also strong pressure from the U.S. Ambassador Joseph Yoon, according to National Assembly members. And of course, there was a documentary by German state television ARD, which echoed the
Mm.
same conspiracy theory. And so
Mm.
we could see that there were tremendous, powerful global forces that were trying to affect the decision. But finally, on 2 days ago, the court gave its decision, and they upheld the impeachment. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief. They found on all the common sense issues essentially that the motive was not justified, that he had no justification for declaring martial law. It was procedurally faulty. His attempt to block off the National Assembly and to send troops was in violation of the law. His sending troops to the National Election Commission was a violation of the law and illegal search and seizure. And his plan to arrest and detain, judges and opponents was illegal. And that was an interesting. It was interesting that they upheld that charge, and therefore they declared that he violated the fundamental principles of law and democracy. He undermined the constitutional order, threatened the stability of the democratic republic, violated his duty, and undermined the authority of constitutional bodies, etc. Abandoned his duty to protect the country, and therefore he is impeached. And then those
So
words come out.
absolutely clear cut, sort of,
Yes,
open and shut case, so to speak, legally. But in the case of removing him from office, am I correct in thinking that the court had to rule unanimously, is that correct, or for the removal from office to proceed, or
they didn't have to rule unanimously.
okay,
Ordinarily, it's a 9-member court.
yep,
They only had 8 justices on the court, and that had to do with the fact that the acting presidents refused to appoint all of the justices that had already been approved. It's a pro forma they should appoint, but they didn't. They only Choi Sang-mok only appointed 2. And so they were one short. There were 8 justices of a 9-member court. They needed 6 votes
that's the rule. Yep.
in order to uphold. They ruled 8-0. Every single one of them ruled unanimously. But I will be honest with you, Jeff, there was a lot of fear that this could be a split decision, that it could very easily have gone 5-3 or 4-4, which means that Yoon would have been back in power. And anybody who's watched the judicial system knows that judging can be very arbitrary.
Mm.
Judge can wake up on the wrong side of the bed. They can be subject to political forces. And I have to assure you that many, many people in Korea were holding their breath, even during that 22-minute process of declaring his verdict. Each time, even as it was becoming more and more clear, people were holding their breath
Mm.
until the very, very last moment,
Mm.
after which, there was exaltation and celebration for the vast majority
Absolutely.
of people.
Absolutely. And with reason too, because I believe there were three kind of conservative, disposed towards Yoon, so to speak, judges on the court who were about to reach their term limit, like next week or something like that. So, or
There were two progressive
two.
judges who would have
Two.
turned out on April 18th. And if they had turned out, the court could not have rendered a judgment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yep. So it wouldn't have required much, perhaps, for one or two people just to be turned by all that sort of pressure. But thankfully, it didn't happen. And how did people? I saw some images of television of people sort of dancing in the streets, but also I saw there was another image I saw earlier today of some people protesting the outcome of the decision. It looked like maybe 1,000 or a couple of thousand of people, waving both Korean. Well, there seemed to be three flags. There was like a Korean flag and an American flag and another flag or banner that I didn't quite recognise. But it seems to have broadly been welcome, but there does seem to be a group of people who are opposed to it. What's been the reaction of people in Korea to the decision?
After Yoon declared martial law, the vast majority of the country was in favor of upholding the impeachment. But there was a very, very concerted media effort driven by conservative forces, conservative religious forces, and in my opinion, also from the United States, from CPAC, from Annie Chan, from Morse Tan, from ARD and etc. So kind of global conservative forces that were putting a lot of pressure, and of course through the facilitation of YouTube, and because of that, there was a significant shift in sentiment. So that towards the end, as we were approaching, these days, it was something like 2-1 in favor of impeachment, but still a good third of the country, according to polls, was opposed to impeachment. And these are, in some sense, these are hardcore conservatives and reactionaries, loyalists to Yoon. And then I think there's another grouping that was synthetically created through this media,
Mhm.
information propaganda warfare. And so it really was touch and go for a while. Certainly, I think the fact that they were waving American flags, I think, tells you a lot. Uh, I think that kind of gives away the game. Remember, Yoon was elected essentially because he was a U.S. client. The U.S. exulted when he was elected. He was a walking wish fulfillment list. The Rand Corporation referred to him as the U.S.'s perfect partner. And of course, he was lauded to the skies as, the perfect, partner of a global pivot state that is fighting for democracy and U.S., U.S. interests. And he was important because he was preparing Korea for war against China. He had instituted the Japan-U.S. Korea alliance, unheard of, unthinkable, but he was the one who made that happen. So his key importance was that he was geostrategically essential for U.S. escalation to war against China, because Korea is the key force projection platform. The interesting thing here, and I believe that the new administration, the new Trump administration, had a significant effect on the direction of Korean politics, in the sense that it was a disruption with the Biden administration's politics. Yoon
Mm.
was a creature of the Biden administration. He was Biden. He serenaded
Yeah, that's
Biden
right.
with,
What
you know,
was the song he sang? It was some ridiculous sentimental American song that I can't
yes,
in the
Miss
White
American
House.
Pie, a long, long
Yeah,
time ago.
that's
Yeah,
right.
it was, yes, absurd song, but he was like the court minstrel to the Biden administration. And I think they were actually quite unhappy that I think they were unhappy that they didn't win the presidency, but also I think they were not happy that his impeachment was upheld. Remember, there was radio silence from all of them. Jake Sullivan was asked, "Did you know about uh, Yoon's? Uh, were you surprised by Yoon's declaration of martial law?" And he responded, unprompted, "I was surprised by his declaration and the sudden rescission of martial law," which is a very, very kind of telling statement in my book. So certainly, we think that the United States would have had foreknowledge simply because it's such a complex military operation to pull something like that off.
Yeah, totally. Just maybe as a observation about that, when we spoke last time, I recall reporting to you the kind of tone of the discussion from the the Center for Strategic International Studies or whatever, the sort of
Yes.
American establishment foreign policy
Yes.
think tank to the Korean crisis, and there was some people heavily involved in some of the more shadowy activities of the US in South Korea participating in the conversation, and they were very suspicious of the opposition candidate and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They ran a similar kind of event in the last 24 hours or so, where it was the general tone was this is a story of the resilience of Korean democracy. The country should unify now. And it was always a clear-cut case that the Yoon should be impeached. So it's good that this has happened and there's no more violence and that kind of stuff. And I saw one of the commentators on the CSIS YouTube said, panel of leftists, a lot of balance there, CSIS. So maybe that's also indicative of perhaps that kind of shift that you're talking about. I don't know.
It's interesting. I mean, CSIS is definitely one of the think tanks to watch, along with CFR, Atlantic, and CNAS, etc. So it's important to watch what these, think tanks are formulating in terms of messaging and policy. Usually, the person behind Korea policy at CSIS is Victor Cha, CHA, and there was a rumor early in Yoon's administration that he was actually Yoon's brain, that he was the kind of alter ego of Yoon. And so if he is talking in this tone, then it signals that they have clearly abandoned him, and also that they're trying to make lemonade out of lemons. Although if you listen to their discourse carefully, they're talking about the importance of finding a centrist candidate who is not radical as Lee Jae-myung, who was the leading opposition candidate.
So, and they didn't have that chap on either. They didn't have any of their harder-edged commentators on. They were the sort of softer variety. But anyhow, we might come back to how America is responding a little bit later. How are the political leadership in Korea responding? And of course, I guess the immediate context of that is the consequence of the removal of President Yoon is there needs to be an election within 60 days. I believe it's going to be June the 3rd.
Yes.
What's been the kind of range of reaction from the political leadership in Korea?
Well, I mean, Lee Jae-myung is very happy. He is not out out of the woods, because
Mm.
one of the reasons, I think it's very clear. I mean, we see it in the research. Uh, Congressional Research Service reports, is they say the timing of the impeachment is very important, and they specifically mention the court cases against Lee Jae-myung, the leading opposition candidate. Lee Jae-myung is 25 percentage points against any other contender. So under normal circumstances, he would be a shoo-in to be elected. And in the previous election in 2022, he was only 0.7 percentage points behind Yoon Suk-yeol. So he could have very easily tipped that election too. So he's clearly the leading candidate. He is a strong, strong contender. The US hates him. They hate his guts. They don't want him because he would balance back towards China, and he would not be an easy walkover, a literal, valet servant, the way that Yoon Suk-yeol was, as far as escalating to war against China was, and reconciling with Japan. So Yoon Suk-yeol is in the doghouse as far as the U.S. is concerned. I think that they would like to see a strong political contender come up against him. And in the meantime, he's still facing 5 other criminal charges that ban him from political activity. I think that I don't think those court cases will be able to proceed fast enough before the election. So he may be out of the woods, and then presidential immunity will kick in. But it just speaks to the kind of dirty tricks that were played on Lee Jae-myung. After he lost, yes.
So just to clarify, Lee, sorry, just
Lee Jae-myung, yes.
He's the leader of, I think, is it the Democratic Party, which is kind of the progressive left-wing-ish sort of party.
It's center left.
Center left. Yep.
It's all relative.
Yeah, like most left-wing parties in the world these days, it's pretty centrist.
Yes.
He has been, let's say, legally harassed. And there was a decision like about a month ago, I guess, about a charge that he was cleared of, I guess. That could have potentially stopped him from running for president.
Absolutely, yes. There was an appeals court case where he had previously been indicted for lying during the campaign. He said that, I was pressured to, rezone an area, etc. And, the court said, you were not pressured. You lied about that. The appellate court said that, no, he hadn't lied. This was not, something that you could fine for as a criminal wrongdoing. But once again, to point out, the dirty nature of Korean politics. I mean, if that initial conviction had been upheld, he would have spent at least a year in prison and been banned from politics for 10 years, immediately knocking him out of presidential candidacy contention. And so, but the way that happened was that immediately after Yoon Suk-yeol was elected, he raided his opposition party leader, Lee Jae-myung's house 400 times. His house was raided 400 times. They tore it upside down looking for something. And eventually they came up with, minor process issues that are highly contentious, and they turn these into criminal cases. And the idea is that, if we just keep on prosecuting and prosecuting and prosecuting you while harassing you, you will eventually give up, or, as often is the case in these types of situations, you will commit suicide. And that has happened before several times with high-ranking Korean politicians. Lee Jae-myung is a man, he's made of, he's made of stern stuff. He's not a pushover. Just to give you some, historical background. he is a kind of he's a huge contrast with Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon Suk-yeol was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He comes from powerful, rich, academic, wealthy Korean aristocratic family that has a strong connection with the Japanese collaborator class during Japan's colonization of Korea. That's why he's happy to collaborate with Japan again. Lee Jae-myung comes from dirt poor working class family. When I say dirt poor, he left school at the age of 12 and he started working in a factory. And if you start working in a factory, that is essentially like being sold into a brothel. You know, you don't come back from that. If you're lucky, you will die of cancer at the age of 40, but you will never accomplish anything in your life. While he was working in this factory, a rubber factory, plastic factory, his arm got mangled, and actually twice. So he's actually disabled. If you look at him carefully, you'll see that he does not have use of one of his arms, which is astounding, you know, if you consider that he's vaulting over walls and things like that. But even while he was working in a factory, he attended night school. And over a period of, you know, what would have been a normal youth for most people, he, you know, was, you know, getting mangled and working himself, you know, to death in a sweatshop. But he still managed to pass the high school equivalency exam. And then he went into law school and received a scholarship. And from receiving that scholarship, he took the bar exam. You know, law is an undergraduate in Korea. And he took the bar exam and he aced the bar exam. And then he became a human rights lawyer, labor lawyer. And then he became the mayor of a city and then of a major province. So his has been a long, prodigious story of continuous achievement and success against unbelievable odds, against incredible odds. And on the other hand, you have Yoon, who is you know, man born with a silver spoon, essentially a playboy clown, never do well, who never accomplished anything. He failed the bar exam 8 times and only passed it on its on his ninth attempt. And so the contrast between them are so extraordinary. But of course, you know, the character like Yoon, you know, a servile clown who is unserious but is pliable, is exactly the kind of character that the U.S. has always used, you know, in their, you know, in their client status, in their when they're.
And it's he's got a very different biography, different political, like, you know, social life experience, I guess, to most of the both right wing and left wing sort of leadership class in you know, most, you know, broadly liberal democratic Western countries these days too. It sounds much more like, you know, the sort of like labor leaders of the 1920s and 1930s than like 100 years ago, rather than today. Now, as I understand it, also the party he's from has control of the Korean legislature, and so and that the current Conservative Party potential candidates, they're very unpopular, and there's no consensus on who they'd be. So the high likelihood is Lee would win the presidential election, and therefore also the presidency and the legislature will be in sync, and that them being out of sync was part of the problem that drove the military coup to some degree. There was a disagreement about spending priorities, let's say.
Yes.
And so there's potentially a situation then where you have a much more, I guess, unified government system around a different set of priorities in Korea in a few weeks. Do you think that is the most likely scenario?
Under normal circumstances, that is the most likely scenario.
Mm,
Yoon is a powerful candidate. He has the support of his entire party, which
mm.
already holds the parliament, the legislature. On the other hand,
Yoon or
I'm
Lee?
sorry, Lee,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
Yes, sorry.
yeah.
And on the other hand, Yoon's party, the PPP party, is highly fractured now.
Mm,
And its candidates, it doesn't have a candidate because didn't they couldn't dream that he would actually be impeached. They were actually preparing to celebrate, if you can
mm,
believe that. And so they're fractured. They don't have a single candidate they can unify around. There's probably going to be a lot of recrimination, a circular firing squad. And here's the other piece, which I think is also important: is Yoon is not only impeached, but he's also facing criminal insurrection charges
mm,
separate from his impeachment. Now,
mm,
he's only facing insurrection charges because he had presidential immunity from other charges. But now that he's no longer president, a whole slew of other criminal charges could be
mm,
levied against him. Now,
mm,
if Yoon's insurrection charge is upheld, then his party is also highly likely to be
mm,
implicated in insurrection. If that's the case, they will have to disband.
mm,
So the
mm,
party itself, Yoon's party, the ruling party, is actually in tremendous jeopardy right now.
mm,
My feeling is that they'll probably switch to a quick rebrand. They'll probably rebrand themselves. They'll change their name. This is something they do every 3 to 4 years.
mm.
It's essentially the same party as the party of Park Chung-hee, the Minjukomwadang, the Democratic Republic Party, but they just keep on changing their name every few
Mm.
years, every time there's a scandal, and they have had a lot of scandals.
So the party system in Korea is more changeable, than for example in the United States or even like Australia, like yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the other, so there's probably some questions there about what all this might mean.
Mhm.
I guess post-election, but maybe
Mhm.
before we're there, what's the kind of is there polarization around this in society? Is it something people will sort of get over? Are some of the conflicts that led to this sort of crisis still there within Korea? What's the kind of feel of Korean society at the moment and how they're sort of dealing with this? I mean, a democratic crisis is not just a political event, it's a social event, I guess. And there was doctors' dispute,
I think
things
there's
like this. Yeah.
I think there's tremendous polarization right now. The
Mm,
language that was coming out of the reactionary pro Yun forces was quite extraordinary. It was also very, very threatening. I mean, as I
mm,
said, they went in and they destroyed a courthouse, the Western courthouse. That has never happened before in Korean history.
mm,
They were talking about, uh, you know, just incitement to huge violence.
mm,
Uh, they were attacking. They were attacking, opposition politicians, the DPK
mm,
politicians, assaulting them. They've also been attacking Chinese tourists or anybody they consider to be Chinese, and so it's actually been very, very dangerous
mm,
for Chinese people in general. And then um, as they were campaigning for Yoon's release, they have been putting forth some very, very disturbing historical tropes. Like they put forth a group of youth and said, we are bringing back the Northwest Youth League. The
mm,
Northwest Youth League these were death squads that they had in the period leading up to the Korean War. This is extraordinary, uh,
mm,
threatening, and disturbing language that they're using. So I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think it's
mm,
still very, very precarious and dangerous. There's still tremendous polarization. But I think one of the things that has kind of attenuated or taken the sails out of the reactionary forces has been Donald Trump's imposition of tariffs on Korea. Because that happened, just the day before the court decision. And South Korea has always considered itself to be the teacher's pet or the favorite child among U.S. vassal states. And when they were slapped with 25% tariffs, I think that was a huge shock, and it will have a huge shock on the Korean economy. And I think this, speaks to the larger pattern inside Korean history, which is that if you think that South Korea is a sovereign state, it's a little bit like thinking it's a bit like having a geocentric theory of astronomical movement, right? You'll see strange retrograde movements that you can't explain. But if you understand that there is a larger gravitational force around which all these political bodies are, circulating, then you'll understand that these retrograde movements and these strange zigzags start to make sense, and that gravitational force is the United States. The center of Korea's political universe is the gravitational force of the United States. And just to give you the kind of the historical breakdown, South Korea has fought and come to the streets in mass 8 times to overthrow their government in 1948, 1960, 1972, 1979, 1980, 1987, 2015, 2025, we could even say 2008. So Koreans have constantly taken to the streets. And when I say take to the streets, I'm talking about in the millions to bring down their governments, which almost always have been U.S. quislings. So certainly 1960, Syngman Rhee, he was a U.S. quisling. 1979, Park Chung-hee, U.S. quisling. 1980, the Gwangju Massacre, Chon Doo-hwan, U.S. quisling. 1987, Chon Doo-hwan, U.S. quisling. 2015, Park Geun-hye. 2016, Park Geun-hye, U.S. quisling. And of course, 2024-25, Yoon Suk-yeol, U.S. quisling. All of them have been challenged by Koreans going to the streets. And if you note the dates that these things happen, you'll notice that they coincide very, very closely with U.S. electoral cycles. So 1960, when Syngman Rhee was overthrown, that was the year that John F. Kennedy was campaigning and later elected. 1972, same thing, Nixon. 1980, Reagan.
Reagan, yeah.
1987, when they overthrew or actually were able to end the military dictatorship of Chon Doo-hwan, that was the lead up to the Olympic Games and also the lead up to a U.S.
Yeah.
And
that was the year there was like a massacre of like tens of. Am I right in thinking there was a terrible massacre? That was the
that was 1980, Gwangju.
Yeah. Oh, that was 1980.
That was hundreds, possibly thousands of people massacred. 1987, 1988, this was the Korean Olympics, so there was so much pressure and visibility that they couldn't engage in another massacre. But 2016, when Park Geun-hye was overthrown, that was the lead up to the election in the U.S. And this year also coincides with Trump's election. And so you can see that there's, kind of a periodicity to these shifts. And also depending on what is happening in the United States, that determines whether these people's uprisings are successful or not. In this case, it seems to have been significantly, successful. But, and I hate to say this, we're not out of the woods yet. We don't know what the outcome is. There could still be more polarization, more street violence, more reactionary forces. And Lee Jae-myung was actually almost assassinated recently. Someone tried to slash his throat. Really, really violent assassination attempt. And so I think, the only thing that is certain in Korean politics is that it is unpredictable, it will be intense, and there will be twists and turns.
The gravitational pull, as you described it, of the United States has obviously had a very profound impact on Korean society. And before we leave that, maybe just talk about some of the, I guess, foreign policy or international relations dimensions of it. I should mention to viewers, we'd initially planned to actually talk about another major piece of news in Korea, which was it in the same week, KJ, or was it the week before? I can't quite remember now. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Korea produced a major report around international adoption scandal and involving Korean children. And just to show you, this is the one of the local papers here in Australia, KJ, and you can maybe just see there, it was the front page of the paper here in Melbourne, Australia. So, and we're planning to have a chat about that. And I guess what it more broadly tells about the deepest, I guess, more the lingering trauma of the Korean War, the division of Korea, and the kind of social and political cleavages that we've sort of been talking about today, which are very profound, and as you say, we don't quite know how they will play out over the next 6 weeks, let alone 4 years. But let's turn maybe to some of the foreign policy or international relations dimensions of things. Can we start first with kind of Japan? Like, what's been the reaction of the decision in Japan?
I think the Japanese are watching things very cautiously, but I'm sure that they, like the United States, are not happy with the decision. I think they're very apprehensive. This could turn back the clock on many of the changes that Yoon had instituted, namely turning South Korea and Japan and the United States into a unified military alliance, what I refer to as JAC, as Japan, Korea, US alliance, which in the context of Korean history is unthinkable because Japan colonized South Korea brutally for over half a century, perpetrating some of the worst crimes of humanity of the 20th century. So the fact that Yoon agreed to have a military alliance with the former colonizer is like somebody agreeing to marry their rapist. It's just, for the vast majority of Koreans, it was unthinkable. And this was one of the reasons why Yoon was so unpopular and why there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets even before this impeachment process and martial law process started. And also, if you look at the first impeachment resolution, that was worked into the impeachment resolution. So there were two impeachment resolutions. The first one failed, but if you look at the first impeachment resolution, they accused Yoon of neglecting geopolitical balance by antagonizing North Korea, China, and Russia, and by pursuing a strange Japan-centered foreign policy. That was actually one of the items they wanted to impeach him on, but the U.S. made them take that out, and they did, and then he was impeached on the second round. So,
and do you think that will be affected by the tariffs issue? I mean, like, as I understand it, China, South Korea, and Japan have established some kind of regional trade agreement just recently. Japan and South Korea are kind of fellow victims of tariff policy. I know in Australia there's a hell of a lot of concern around trying to protect a sort of open trading system in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, critically for Australia. So do you think that will be a moderating factor potentially in terms of relationships between Japan and Korea?
It could be,
Mm,
but I still remain a little bit skeptical,
mm,
because what I'm seeing here is that the geopolitical track and the commercial economic track seem to be moving on separate parallel
okay.
tracks. So it's very possible that South Korea and China and Japan could, kind of decide to organize together to resist US tariffs at the same time that they still continue to go along with US geopolitical strategy.
Mm,
Certainly Japan doesn't look
mm,
like it's going to waver from that. But
mm,
it's a little bit unknown because the Trump administration is also sending very confusing and mixed messages. The fact that it has levied these tariffs on some of the most absurd, you know, you know, reasoning possible, right? I mean, it's like they took some intern and told them to come up with something, right? Essentially, it's trade imbalance as the numerator, and the amount of exports to the United States as a denominator, and they took that as a percentage and divided it by two, and that's
mm,
how they're going to determine what is an equitable tariff or reciprocal
mm,
tariff. That's a kind of absurdity that I can't make head or tail of, and I don't know of any professional
mm,
economist who can either.
mm,
It's just an absurdity. But Trump says he loves tariffs, says he loves it more than the word love, and he's certainly, a neo-mercantil freak. He
mm,
wants the world restructured in a neo-mercantil system, even though that there are profound and deep contradictions in what he wants to do. He wants to maintain the U.S. as the global reserve currency, and at the same time he also wants to have to remove all trade imbalances
mm,
with other countries, and those two things are incompatible, right? It's the Triffin dilemma. If you
mm,
want your currency to be the global reserve currency, you actually have to have a current account balance so that there's
mm,
extra currency circulating in the world system so that other countries can use your
mm.
currency as a reserve currency. So there's
Yep.
some profound contradictions involved, but essentially what it will do is it will create inflation in the United States, and it's likely to create a global recession, as we're already seeing with the
Mm.
tremendous impacts on the stock
Yep.
exchange.
Yep. And you did a great interview with Rachel Blevins on Rachel Blevins' show, which I'll include a link to in the video description below, uh, if people want to check that out. And also my sort of, I don't know, what would you say, associate collaborator Warwick Powell has also written a really great Substack on the sort of trade issue implications of this as well. So I'll include a link to that as well. What about China? You said before Lee might tack towards China in some way if he becomes president. What's the potential? And I guess everyone around the world, including Australia, are trying to work out what exactly are the American intentions towards China and potential war with China. At the moment, a very scary scenario, but how do you see the sort of relationship? How do you see, potential change in Korea potentially impacting the relationships of East Asian nations, Korea, rest of the world with China?
Well, I think there has been the question, is Trump continuing Biden's policies against China, which was essentially containment and escalation to war? Or is he just Mr. Chaos? He's, creating chaos in global affairs? Or is he consolidating in some fashion? Is he consolidating into, regions, spheres of influence? Or is he moving towards a division of labor? And if we look at what Pete Hegseth is saying about China, it looks like that is the case. That is to say, they're saying Europe will deal with Russia, and we will retrench, and we will consolidate our force and our power so that we can focus on China. And recent statements and recent leaks of DoD paper on the interim national defense guidance memo says that China is, the sole pacing threat, and the sole challenge that we have to marshal all our forces to prepare for war against. So it looks like, from the stand of the DoD, that they are seriously concentrating and reprioritizing towards war with China. And if you look on the ground, you can see things that corroborate that. Most notably in Korea, even as this impeachment was happening, tremendous escalation and intensification of war games and exercises destined to rehearse war against China under the pretext of doing it against North Korea. So very recently, you saw the bombing of 152 houses in a South Korean village near the North Korean border. This was done under a U.S.-led, war game, which was, a rehearsal for war with North Korea / China, because they have a mutual defense treaty. And of course, that in war, 5 to 25% of casualties are actually friendly fire casualties. So this was actually a very, very, accurate, rehearsal for war, in that it was a massive friendly fire, incident. 152 houses destroyed, something in the range of scores of people injured, etc. So intensification of war preparations in Korea. You see the intensive porcupining of Taiwan Island. They've just sent them, new F-16s, the most recent F-16s, and they are passing, sending them all the weapons that they can. And of course, Lai Ching-te in Taiwan Island has just tried to pass these 17 measures that will obstruct any kind of peaceful resolution or reunification with China. And he wants to institute military tribunals on Taiwan Island. I believe that both Yoon and Lai Ching-te were preparing to declare martial law, because these are the two kind of respective force projection platforms, and they will have been the most easiest places with which to trigger war. And of course, behind this, the key naval and air force projection platform is Japan. And Pete Hegseth was in Japan, a few days ago, gave just a ridiculous speech praising the Japanese, forces, almost as if that the U.S. had not been fighting against the Japanese in World War II, as if they had been, allies. But one of the things that he declared was that the United States is preparing to create a joint operations command for Japan. Now, this is very similar to South Korea. The U.S. has a joint command over U.S. and South Korean troops. Now, when we say joint command, that means that there will be a Japanese general and a U.S. general leading both forces. But in actuality, that's an absurdity. There is no American general who's going to take orders from a Japanese general, just as there is no U.S. general who's going to take any orders from a Korean general. So both of these joint commands will be U.S. led. In other words, they're setting up Japan to have a force structure like Korea, where essentially the U.S. controls Korean forces and the U.S. controls Japanese forces. Why is this important? U.S. still currently has technically OPCON, wartime OPCON, over all of South Korea's forces. That's 500,000 regular troops plus 3.1 million reserve troops, 3.6 troops total. That's a huge force projection platform, a force multiplier. In the case of Japan, Japan is, the fourth most powerful military in the world, certainly one of the most powerful navies on the planet. It will soon have the third largest military budget on the planet, and the U.S. will have control over Japanese forces. And so, once again, a tremendous force multiplier for U.S. force projection in the Pacific as it escalates to war against China.
Yeah, I had you had an interview with a leading Australian defence analyst, Sam Rogveen, on my show a few days ago, and I guess his argument was rationality would suggest that America would not win a war with China, so that they're talking tough, but they're unlikely to do that. But I do wonder, and you referred to Pete Hegseth's speech in Japan, where he described Japan as an indispensable warrior nation, and he's got this whole theme at the moment of warrior ethos. You do wonder whether we're not entirely in the realm of rationality, which doesn't mean people are insane. It just means they're driven by emotions and ideas that are not rational calculations, I guess, perhaps of what costs and benefits of a military conflict. They're sort of they're acting in a way to project an image of themselves as a warrior nation, supreme America, that sort of thing. And I guess that's my concern. And this tariff decision is I guess, evidence towards that concern, because it's just so crazy.
It doesn't make any sense. Yes,
Yeah.
but if we think about whether this makes sense, I mean, on the surface, there's a kind of rationality. You can see that this has been strategically mapped out for a long time, certainly since at least 2011 with the Obama administration. In the case of Japan, they encouraged Japan to remilitarize and to abandon its, peace constitution. And then they signed legislation agreements allowing Japan to fight with the United States anywhere and anytime the US fights. And then they had this acceleration, this budget increase, doubling the budget, making it the third largest military budget on the planet. And then now they're looking towards the Koreanization of Japanese forces so that they can take over Japanese forces in time of war, as they can with Korea. So there's a kind of surface logic and rationality, but undergirding it is a kind of madness that believes that the United States can win a war against a peer competitor. Now, we have seen very clearly the recent New York Times leak article, shows that the US was clearly involved directly in war against Russia. It was, doing the targeting. It was responsible in, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, deciding the weapons platforms, and responsible also for strategy, tactics, operations. So the Ukraine war has shown very clearly that this was not just a proxy war where the U.S. was supplying arms and giving moral succor, but it was actually a U.S.-Russia war. They were directly going against each other, and it's shown that the best of U.S. doctrine, strategy, tactics, operations, and weaponry and technology cannot win against Russia, which the United States considers not to be a peer competitor, but a gas station masquerading as a country. Now, if the US cannot beat Russia, what on earth makes them think that they can beat China, which is much, much more powerful and which would be fighting in its own home court and which has an economy which is 9 times larger than Russia, which is, by purchasing power parity, the largest economy on the planet. What makes them think that? And I discussed this with Rachel, but I call it a grizzly bear fallacy. So YouGov government poll has done, survey of Americans. 6% of Americans believe that they can fight barehanded against a grizzly bear, go hand to hand against a grizzly bear and defeat it. That's 6% of adult, sentient, intelligent adults respond that way. 7% of males. I think 8% believe that they can beat a lion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of absurd, this, overwhelming sense of their own power. And there's a part of me that wonders if, if Pete Hegseth were surveyed, would he be one of these 6%, 7%, 8% people who believe that they can fight against, absurd odds and still prevail? I think that is an
Yeah,
ideology that may
yeah.
pervade, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, and I mean, there's that. I mean, culturally, that sort of machismo culture in both North American and South American societies has been very strong in both military institutions, but also in political institutions. And like, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, was a perfect example of that. Love to get himself shot, having photograph shooting elephants and this kind of thing. So I do feel, and even if you read the conversation in the Signal chat about the bombing of Yemen,
Yes.
there's all this sort of machismo posturing really
Yes.
about it, rather than the sort of soft Europeans who don't invest enough in their military hardware.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
But
fantastic.
I do want to point out that Teddy Roosevelt never went hand to hand against
Yeah.
an animal. He always had a weapon. So
Yeah, that's right. Fantastic. So yeah, interesting times, KJ. I mean, maybe the hopeful note is that the way this tariff decision is playing out, which I guess it's still early days, but doesn't seem to be going down all that well, might hem in the sort of more aggressive postures from the United States government at the moment. But we will see. We will see. We will see.
Yes, certainly.
Before we wrap up, maybe do you? I did mention the child adoption story earlier on, and we will talk about that in a couple of weeks, including how I guess relates to the broader issues of historical trauma and all that sort of stuff within Korea. Did you want to just briefly give a quick summary of that before we sign off? And thank you for your wonderful insights today.
Yes, I think this is actually a very, very important story. On the surface, it looks like a story of broken families, of children who had their parents taken away, or their childhoods, lost, betrayed. I think that's the kind of human interest story there, and certainly that's what's being focused on in the Western media. But this was an extensive investigation by the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, councils, and they were trying to unpack what had happened so that 250,000 Koreans were exported to the West, 250,000 children.
Quarter of a million. Wow.
Quarter of a million. And, to, give away the plot, essentially, they are saying, I think that we can characterize it as systemic trafficking. It was a systemic trafficking of children for profit, and it comes out of a larger geopolitical system that has to do with the kind of extraction of value and of humans towards the global north. The genesis of this really starts with the comfort women, which is also a colonial imposition. These comfort women had children who they could not raise. These were put into orphanages. Then these orphanages started to export them. It became a source of
really? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
It became a source of great, national, export. It was literally. They would get $3,000 for each child plus additional bribes. That was a huge amount of money, and so they turned into an industry unto itself. And then in this process, there were tremendous abuses. Children not adoptable, having their papers forged and simply sent aboard. So these kids were kidnapped and exported under fraudulent circumstances. This is a tremendous human tragedy, but also a deep indictment of the kind of imperial colonial system and its racism that made this possible.
I'll be really interested to talk to you about that, KJ, and partly because, like, over the course of my government career, I had some connections with both the international adoption issue specifically, as well as more broadly, child family policy, including, surrogacy and all those kind of issues. And curiously enough, just to draw a link to that other big geopolitical event, one of the other countries where there's been, systemic problems with, sex trafficking, bad surrogacy laws, the kind of, exporting of children, basically, in exporting people in bad situations, is Ukraine. So there is, as you say, a geopolitical connection to some of these social policy failures and social policy tragedies. Just as one last final word, KJ, what do you think people should most look out for with the development of the Korean political situation over the next, weeks leading up to the election? Is there one thing that they should particularly, keep an eye on in terms of events?
Well, I can tell people what I will be keeping an eye on. I'll be looking out for statements from the United States or silence from the United States regarding Lee Jae-myung's candidacy and the Korean political process. I would watch that very carefully. And we're already starting to see in the media, for example, Fox News just came out with an article today saying that, Lee Jae-myung's Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment was a Chinese conspiracy. So I would watch out for that kind of escalation. In general, I would watch out for the escalation of information warfare. That is a bad sign. I've always said that those who tell you absurdities are preparing you for atrocities. The farther we are away from truth, the closer we are to war. So I would watch that, carefully. And then I would also watch for developments in Yoon's case. Will the criminal prosecution move forward? Will he be indicted? And how will that affect his party? If his party is indicted as well, that's the end of the PPP, the ruling party. That will be a clear, clear track for Lee Jae-myung to move ahead. But there's a possibility of, reactionary forces, counter pro-Yoon forces that could also be instigated. I think the fact that the Trump administration has a kind of discontinuity with the Biden administration has opened up a space for political change in Korea. I think certainly the defunding of the NED and USAID probably also had an effect. And the fact that Trump levied these powerful sanctions against Korea has taken the wind out of these reactionaries who have been fighting for Yoon under the delusion that they have been also fighting for the United States and waving US flags. I think that has knocked the air out of them a little bit too. But we don't know. And, as I said, these are very, very deep, intense conflicts. They go back to the Japanese era. And they're also recurring conflicts. Like I said, this is the 8th time that the South Koreans have risen up and the 4th time that they have managed to overthrow a quisling government. So hopefully, this historical cycle is about to shift. We'll transition into a better place. But the geopolitical situation in the Asia Pacific is so fraught and so high pressure that I'm not making any easy predictions or any easy claims. As they say, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. There are not going to be any easy victories here.
Yeah, absolutely. And viewers can check out your sort of regular commentary on Breakthrough News, where you do the China report. Yep.
Yes, the Breakthrough News Network on YouTube. And if you look for the China Report, every week we do a show around China and the Pacific.
Yep. And I certainly see you from time to time on Jamal Thomas's show and Rachel Levin's show. So absolutely, if this is the first time viewers have caught KJ, do check him out on YouTube. It's absolutely fantastic insights. Thanks so much for joining me today, KJ.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you.